The crimson jungle pulsed like a living beast, its vines curling with an eerie glow as someone, stirred in the shadows. Elias had spent his life running, but tonight, the whispers in the dark were calling him forward. Behind the waterfall, past the blood-red canopy, a secret lay bound in chains. Three beings not quite human, their eyes burning with a power the world had tried to erase. He should have turned away. He should have left them. But as their gazes locked onto his, the truth was undeniable. This was the beginning of something far greater he'd ever imagined, and he was already caught in its grasp. Want more epic tales of survival, power, and forbidden bonds? Subscribe now and step into a world where the hunted rise, the lost find their way, and the whisper of destiny is impossible to ignore. Don't miss what comes next. The crimson jungle stretched endlessly before Elias, a labyrinth of blood-red vines and towering trees that pulsed faintly with an eerie, living glow. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sweeter, something primal that tugged at the edges of his senses. His boots sank into the soft, reddish soil, the only sound the rhythmic squelch beneath his feet and the distant roar of a waterfall hidden somewhere in the haze. Night had fallen, draping the forest in a shroud of shadows broken only by the luminescent tendrils dangling from the canopy above, casting a scarlet sheen across his weathered face. Elias was no stranger to solitude. Years of living on the fringes, a smuggler cast out by a society that branded him a traitor, had hardened him to the silence. But tonight, something stirred in the stillness, something that made his pulse quicken. He paused, tilting his head as a faint sound pierced the ambient hum of the jungle. It was barely audible at first, a whisper beneath the cascade of water, but it grew clearer as he strained to listen, a low, keening moan, almost human, yet not quite. His hand instinctively dropped to the dagger at his hip, fingers brushing the worn leather hilt. The jungle was no place for the careless. He'd seen men torn apart by its unseen predators, their screams swallowed by the crimson canopy. Yet this sound wasn't a threat. It was a plea. Curiosity, or perhaps the loneliness he refused to name, pulled him forward. He adjusted the tattered leather coat, slung over his shoulders, and pushed through the undergrowth, the glowing vines brushing against his arms like the caress of a phantom. The waterfall came into view, a shimmering curtain of silver slicing through the red haze, its roar drowning out the jungle's whispers. Elias squinted, his sharp green eyes catching a flicker of movement behind the torrent. A jagged opening, barely visible, yawned in the rock face, a cave hidden from all but the most persistent seekers. The moan came again, weaker now, tugging at something deep within him. He'd spent too long running, too long hiding from the ghosts of his past. Maybe this was a chance to feel something again. With a steadying breath, he stepped closer, parting the vines that clung wetly to his skin, and slipped behind the waterfall. The transition was jarring. The roar of the falls dulled to a muted rumble as he entered the cave, his boots echoing on the slick stone floor. Dim light pulsed from clusters of glowing crystals embedded in the walls, casting an unearthly shimmer across the chamber. His breath caught as his eyes adjusted, revealing a sight that froze him in place. Three figures lay sprawled across the ground, their bodies bound by coarse ropes that bit into their glistening flesh. They weren't human, not entirely. Their skin shimmered like polished pearl, catching the crystal light in iridescent waves, and delicate, translucent wings hung limply from their backs, torn and fragile as gossamer. They were alive, but barely, their chests rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Elias stepped closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. The first figure had skin the color of smoldering embers, her wild hair spilling around her shoulders like a cascade of fire. Her wings, though tattered, glinted with a metallic sheen, hinting at a strength that belied her current state. Beside her lay another, her eyes closed, but her features striking. High cheekbones framed by hair as dark as the midnight sky, streaked with violet that shimmered faintly. The third had hair like spun silver, catching the light in a way that made it seem to dance even in stillness. Her body curled protectively inward. Their clothing, little more than rags, clung to their forms, revealing curves and contours that stirred something primal in him, a heat he quickly shoved aside. He knelt beside the red-skinned one, his fingers brushing the ropes that bound her wrists. Up close, she was breathtaking, her beauty both alien and intoxicating. Her lips parted slightly as if whispering in her sleep. Who were they? And why were they here, abandoned in a place no one should have found? His mind raced with possibilities, slavers, hunters, or worse, the enforcers of the ruling council, who hunted anything that didn't fit their rigid order. Elias had seen their cruelty firsthand, had carried the scars of their judgment. He'd sworn never to tangle with them again. The smart move would be to walk away, to leave this mystery buried in the jungle. But then her eyes fluttered open, brilliant amber, sharp and wild, locking onto his with an intensity that pinned him in place. A low growl rumbled from her throat, and before he could react, she lunged, snapping the weakened ropes with a surge of strength that sent him sprawling backward. Her body pressed against his, warm and taut, her clawed hands pinning his shoulders to the stone. Water from the falls still clung to his skin, mingling with the heat of her breath as it grazed his neck. "Who are you?" she snarled, her voice rough with disuse, yet carrying a husky edge that sent a shiver down his spine. Elias kept his hands raised, his pulse racing beneath her grip. "Not your enemy," he managed, meeting her gaze. "I'm Elias. I found you here." She didn't move, her amber eyes narrowing as they searched his face, her body a tense coil of power and suspicion. For a moment, the cave was silent save for the drip of water and the faint hum of the crystals. Then, slowly, she eased off him, her wings flexing slightly as she rose, still wary but no longer poised to strike. Elias rubbed his shoulder, his mind reeling. Whatever these creatures were, they were no ordinary prey, and he just stepped into something far bigger than himself. Elias scrambled to his feet, brushing the damp grit from his coat as the red-skinned woman loomed before him, her amber eyes glinting like twin flames in the dim cave. Her presence filled the space, an intoxicating mix of danger and allure, her torn rags barely concealing the lithe strength of her body. The faint shimmer of her wings caught the crystal light, casting fleeting shadows across the stone walls. She stood poised, claws flexed, her tail, a slender, whip-like extension he hadn't noticed before, flicking restlessly behind her. "Elias," she repeated, tasting the name as if weighing its worth. Her voice was low, edged with a roughness that hinted at long captivity. "Why free us?" He kept his hands visible, his gaze steady despite the heat rising in his chest. "Because leaving you here didn't feel right," he said simply, the words spilling out before he could second-guess them. "I don't know who you are or what you've done, but no one deserves to be trussed up like that." Her eyes narrowed further, searching his face for deceit, her breath close enough that he could feel its warmth against his skin. For a heartbeat, he thought she might lunge again, but instead, she stepped back, her tail stilling as she glanced at her companions. "I'm Sira," she said at last, her tone grudging but tinged with something softer. Reluctance, perhaps, or the faintest flicker of trust. "These are my kin." She gestured to the others, who were stirring now, their movements sluggish, as if waking from a deep, unnatural slumber. Elias watched, transfixed, as the violet-haired one sat up, her eyes fluttering open to reveal a deep, luminous purple that seemed to pierce straight through him. Her beauty was quieter than Sira's, delicate yet commanding, her lips curving into a faint, disoriented smile as she took in her surroundings. The silver-haired one followed, her movements precise despite her evident weakness, her silver eyes scanning the cave with a clarity that unnerved him. "There's Silvara," Sira continued, her voice hardening as she spoke the name. "Or what's left of us." Elias frowned, the word tugging at a memory buried deep, tales of a lost race, hunted to near extinction by the ruling council for powers they couldn't control. He dismissed them as campfire stories, but the reality before him was undeniable. "What happened to you?" he asked, stepping closer despite the warning glint in Sira's gaze. She didn't answer immediately, her claws retracting slightly as she turned to help the violet-haired one to her feet. "Lyra," Sira said, nodding to her companion. "And Vera." The silver-haired one inclined her head, her expression unreadable as she brushed a strand of hair from her face, revealing the elegant sweep of her neck. Elias swallowed, caught off guard by the sudden awareness of their presence, the way Lyra's eyes lingered on him, soft yet probing, and the subtle grace in Vera's movements as she tested the strength of her wings. "The council caught us," Sira said finally, her voice dropping to a bitter growl. "They wanted our secrets, our whisper link. When we wouldn't give it, they left us here to rot." Elias's jaw tightened. He knew the council's methods, ruthless, calculated, and utterly devoid of mercy. He'd run from them once, paid the price in scars and sleepless nights. "They'll come back for you," he said, more to himself than to them. "They don't leave loose ends." Sira's lips curled into a faint, feral smile. "Let them try," she murmured, her tail flicking again as she stepped closer, her body radiating a heat that made the air between them feel charged. "But why risk your neck for us, Elias? What's in it for you?" He met her gaze, unflinching. "Maybe I'm tired of running," he said, his voice low but firm. "Maybe I see something worth fighting for." Her smile faded, replaced by a flicker of surprise, and for a moment, the cave seemed to shrink around them, the tension shifting into something heavier, more electric. Before she could respond, Lyra's voice cut through the silence, soft and melodic, like a breeze rustling through leaves. "He's telling the truth," she said, her purple eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that made his skin prickle. "I can feel it." Sira shot her a sharp look, but Lyra didn't waver, rising to her feet with a grace that belied her earlier weakness. She stepped closer, her wings trembling slightly as they caught the light, and reached out, her fingers brushing his wrist. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt through him, warm, electric, as if she'd slipped beneath his skin. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "Feeling you," Lyra replied, her smile widening faintly. "Your heart. It's lonely but strong. You've lost much." Elias pulled back, startled by the accuracy of her words, but her touch lingered in his mind, stirring something he couldn't name. Vera spoke then, her voice cool and precise. "She's right," she said, standing now, her silver hair shimmering as she adjusted her tattered rags. "But we need to move. They'll track us soon." Elias nodded, forcing his focus back to the present. "I have a place," he said, glancing at Sira, "hidden deep in the jungle. If you trust me." Sira studied him for a long moment, her amber eyes unreadable, then gave a curt nod. "For now," she said, her tail brushing his leg as she turned to help Lyra and Vera. Elias exhaled, his mind racing as he led them out of the cave, the weight of their presence pressing against him like a promise or a curse. Whatever he'd stumbled into, there was no turning back now. The air outside hit him like a slap, cool and damp from the waterfall's mist, a sharp contrast to the stifling closeness of the cave. The crimson jungle loomed ahead, its glowing vines swaying as if beckoning them deeper into its embrace. Elias glanced back, his breath catching as Sira supported Lyra with a firm grip, her red skin glistening under the faint light filtering through the canopy. Vera followed close behind, her silver eyes darting to the shadows, wings flexing as though testing their strength. They moved with a quiet grace, their ragged clothing clinging to their forms, revealing flashes of pearlescent skin that made his pulse quicken despite himself. He shook his head, forcing his focus to the path ahead. This wasn't the time for distraction. "Where are we going?" Sira's voice cut through the silence, sharp and demanding, her tail flicking with impatience. Elias kept his pace steady, navigating the tangled undergrowth with practiced ease. "A hideout," he replied, his tone clipped. "A few miles west. It's off their maps, safe for now." She didn't respond, but he felt her gaze boring into his back, a weight as tangible as the humid air pressing against his skin. Lyra stumbled slightly, and Sira tightened her hold, murmuring something in a melodic tongue he couldn't understand. The sound sent a shiver down his spine, stirring an ache he hadn't felt in years. As they moved, Lyra's head lifted, her purple eyes locking onto his with a clarity that made him falter. "You're afraid," she said softly, her voice weaving through the rustle of leaves like a thread of silk. Elias stiffened, his hand tightening on his dagger. "I'm not," he lied, but her faint smile told him she knew better. "Not of us," she continued, stepping closer as Sira steadied her. "Of what this means." Before he could protest, she reached out again, her fingers grazing his arm. That same jolt surged through him, warm, electric, pulling at something buried deep. Visions flickered in his mind. A child's laughter, a burning village, the sting of betrayal. His own memories, raw and unbidden. He yanked his arm back, heart pounding. "What was that?" he demanded, his voice rough with unease. Sira's eyes narrowed, but Lyra only tilted her head, her wings trembling slightly. "The whisper link," she said. "It's waking up. You feel it too, don't you?" Elias stared at her, the jungle's crimson glow framing her like a halo. He didn't answer, couldn't, but the truth hummed in his veins, undeniable and terrifying. Whatever they were, they'd already begun to change him. Elias led the way through the crimson jungle, his steps sure despite the unease coiling in his gut. The glowing vines overhead cast a scarlet sheen across the path, their faint hum blending with the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of unseen creatures. Sira's presence loomed behind him, her tail occasionally brushing the undergrowth with a soft hiss, while Lyra and Vera followed in a quiet procession, their wings catching the light like fractured mirrors. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and something else, a pull he couldn't name, tugging at the edges of his awareness ever since Lyra's touch had sparked those fleeting visions. The hideout emerged from the foliage after what felt like hours, a ramshackle structure of wood and woven vines tucked beneath the overhang of a massive, gnarled tree. Its walls blended seamlessly with the jungle, a relic of his smuggling days when he needed a place to vanish. Elias pushed aside a curtain of crimson tendrils and gestured them inside. "It's not much," he said, his voice gruff as he lit a small oil lamp, its flickering flame casting shadows across the cramped interior. "But it'll keep us hidden." Sira stepped in first, her amber eyes scanning the space with a predator's wariness, her torn rags shifting to reveal the taut curve of her hip as she moved. Elias averted his gaze, heat creeping up his neck. Lyra entered next, her steps faltering until Sira steadied her with a hand on her arm. She sank onto a crude bench, her violet hair spilling over her shoulders, framing her face in a way that made her look both fragile and untouchable. Vera lingered near the doorway, her silver eyes fixed on the jungle beyond, as if expecting pursuit to materialize from the shadows. Elias busied himself with a crate of supplies, dried meat, a flask of water, anything to keep his hands occupied and his mind from the strange warmth Lyra's words had stirred. "The whisper link," she called it. He didn't understand it, but he felt it, a thread weaving through his thoughts, binding him to them. "You're restless," Lyra said suddenly, her voice soft but piercing the silence like a blade. Elias froze, the flask halfway to his lips, and turned to find her watching him, her purple eyes luminous in the lamplight. "I can feel it. Your heart races even now." Sira snorted, leaning against the wall with her arms crossed, her tail flicking lazily. "He's human," she said, her tone dry. "They're all restless until they break." But there was a glint in her gaze, a challenge that made his skin prickle. "I'm fine," Elias muttered, setting the flask down harder than he meant to. Lyra rose, her wings trembling slightly as she crossed the small space to stand before him. Up close, her scent, wildflowers and something faintly electric, filled his senses, intoxicating and disarming. "You're not," she said, her hand hovering near his chest before settling lightly against his coat. The contact sent a jolt through him, sharper than before, and he saw it again. Flashes of his past, a child's hand slipping from his grasp, flames licking at a wooden roof, the bitter sting of exile. But this time, there was more, her presence woven into it, a soothing balm against the raw edges of his pain. "What are you doing to me?" he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. Lyra's lips curved, a faint, knowing smile. "Sharing," she said. "The whisper link, it binds us if we let it." Her fingers pressed harder, and he felt her loneliness, her fear, her quiet strength, flooding into him like a tide. He staggered back, breaking the connection, his breath ragged. Sira straightened, her eyes narrowing. "Careful, Lyra," she warned. "He's not ready." But Lyra didn't retreat. She stepped closer, her wings brushing the air, and Elias felt the heat of her nearness, the pull of her gaze. "He is," she said softly. "He just doesn't know it yet." Before he could respond, Sira moved, her own presence cutting through the moment like a blade. She shed the tattered remains of her clothing, letting them fall to reveal the full expanse of her red skin, shimmering under the lamp's glow. "If we're staying," she said, her voice laced with a teasing edge as she plucked a spare shirt from his crate, "I'll need something less ruined." Elias's throat tightened, his eyes tracing the lines of her body before he forced them away, heat surging through him. Vera's voice broke the tension, cool and measured. "We need to rest," she said, stepping inside at last. "They'll come soon. The council doesn't abandon its prey." Elias nodded, grateful for the distraction, but Lyra's touch lingered in his mind, and Sira's bold confidence left an imprint he couldn't shake. Whatever this whisper link was, it was more than a bond. It was a fire smoldering beneath the surface, threatening to consume him. And as the jungle hummed outside, he realized he wasn't sure he wanted to resist. The hideout settled into an uneasy quiet, the lamp's flickering light painting the walls with shifting shadows. Elias sat on a crate, his back to the wall, the flask of water forgotten in his hand as he wrestled with the echoes of Lyra's touch. Her whisper link had torn open something inside him, a vulnerability he'd buried beneath years of solitude and scars. Sira's presence didn't help, her borrowed shirt hanging loosely over her frame, the hem brushing her thighs as she prowled the small space, her tail flicking with restless energy. Vera knelt by the doorway, her silver hair catching the glow as she traced faint runes into the dirt with a slender finger, her lips moving silently. The air thrummed with an unspoken tension, thick and palpable, pressing against Elias like a second skin. "What exactly is this whisper link?" he asked at last, his voice rough, breaking the silence. Sira paused, her amber eyes glinting as she turned to him, one hip cocked against the wall. "It's us," she said simply, her tone carrying a weight that belied her casual stance. "What we are." The council called it a threat, said it made us too dangerous to live. She smirked, but there was no humor in it, only a bitter edge that cut deeper than her claws. They weren't wrong. Lyra shifted on the bench, her wings folding tighter against her back as she met his gaze. "It's how we connect," she said, her voice softer, threaded with a warmth that drew him in despite himself. "Mind to mind, heart to heart. We share strength, thoughts, feelings." Her eyes flickered, and Elias felt it again, that faint tug, a whisper of her presence brushing against his thoughts. He saw a fleeting image, a crystalline city swallowed by flames, screams echoing through the air, and Lyra's hand reaching for someone she couldn't save. He flinched, the flask slipping from his grip to clatter against the floor. "You saw that," she murmured, more statement than question. Elias nodded, his jaw tight. "Your past?" he asked. She inclined her head, her violet hair falling forward to shadow her face. "Part of it. The council burned our home, tried to break us apart. The whisper link kept us alive." Sira's tail lashed, her claws flexing as she added, "It's why they hunted us. They couldn't control it, couldn't control us." Her voice dropped, a husky growl that sent a shiver through him, and she stepped closer, her bare legs brushing the edge of his crate. Imagine what it could do to someone like you. Before he could respond, Vera stood, her runes glowing faintly in the dirt, casting a soft light across her form. "It's done," she said, her voice precise, cutting through the charged air. "A shroud, small, but it'll mask us from their trackers for now." Elias glanced at her, caught by the way the glow illuminated her silver hair, tracing the elegant lines of her neck and shoulders. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable, but something in her posture, the slight tilt of her head, the curve of her lips, stirred a heat he couldn't ignore. "You're good at this," he said, gesturing to the runes. "Better than good." "I've had time to learn," Vera replied, brushing dirt from her hands. "The council kept us in cages, thought they could study us. I turned their tools against them." She stepped closer, the light playing across her skin, and Elias's breath hitched as she knelt to adjust a rune near his feet, her fingers brushing his boot. The contact was brief, but it lingered, a spark that fed the fire Lyra had ignited. Sira chuckled, low and throaty. "Careful, human," she teased, leaning over him so her shirt gaped slightly, revealing the shimmer of her red skin. "We might overwhelm you." He swallowed hard, forcing his eyes back to Lyra, who watched him with a quiet intensity. "What else can it do?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. She tilted her head, her wings trembling as she rose and crossed to him, her scent, wild and electric, filling the space between them. "It grows," she said, her hand hovering near his face. "The more we trust, the stronger it becomes." She hesitated, then pressed her palm to his cheek, and this time, he didn't pull away. Her touch flooded him, her fear, her hope, and something deeper, a longing that mirrored his own. His hand rose instinctively, covering hers, and for a moment, the world narrowed to the heat of her skin against his. A sharp crack split the air, a branch snapping outside. Vera tensed, her runes flaring brighter, and Sira whirled toward the door, claws extended. "They're here," Vera said, her voice calm but urgent. Elias leapt to his feet, the warmth of Lyra's touch fading as adrenaline surged through him. He grabbed his dagger, his eyes meeting Sira's. "How many?" he asked. She sniffed the air, her tail stiffening. "Too many," she growled. The jungle's hum turned menacing, and Elias realized the whisper link wasn't just a bond. It was a weapon, and they were about to test its limits. The jungle's hum turned menacing, and Elias realized the whisper link wasn't just a bond. It was a weapon, and they were about to test its limits. He tightened his grip on the dagger, its familiar weight grounding him as the air outside the hideout thickened with the promise of violence. Sira crouched low, her amber eyes glinting in the lamplight, her claws flexing as she sniffed the air again. "At least 6, she hissed, her tail lashing like a whip. "Mercenaries, council dogs." Vera's runes pulsed brighter, casting an eerie glow across her silver hair as she rose, her voice steady despite the tension. "They've breached the outer shroud. We have minutes, maybe less." Elias moved to the doorway, peering through the curtain of crimson vines. Shadows flickered beyond the trees, dark shapes weaving through the undergrowth, their armor glinting faintly under the jungle's scarlet glow. The faint clink of metal and the rustle of boots confirmed Sira's count. His pulse hammered in his ears, a rhythm he'd known too well from his smuggling days. Danger closing in, no room for hesitation. "We can't stay here," he said, turning to the Silvara. "They'll surround us." Sira bared her teeth, a feral grin spreading across her face. "Then we take the fight to them," she said, her voice a low growl that sent a shiver down his spine. Before he could argue, Lyra's hand found his arm, her touch a sudden anchor in the chaos. "Wait," she murmured, her purple eyes wide and unfocused, as if seeing beyond the walls. "I feel them, their intent. They're spreading out, trying to flank us." Elias stared at her, the warmth of her fingers seeping into his skin, and then it hit him, a faint ripple through his mind, sharp and clear. He saw it too. vague shapes moving in his thoughts, their positions flickering like ghosts. The Whisperlink. "You're doing this," he said, his voice rough with awe. Lyra nodded, her grip tightening. "Through you," she whispered. "Trust it." Sira didn't wait for more. She shoved past him, her wings snapping open as she darted into the jungle, her red skin blending with the crimson vines like a predator born to this place. Elias cursed under his breath and followed, Lyra and Vera close behind. The air outside was electric, charged with the scent of wet earth and imminent bloodshed. Sira struck first, a blur of motion as she tackled a mercenary emerging from the shadows. Her claws raked across his chest plate, sparks flying as he stumbled back with a shout. Elias lunged at another, his dagger flashing in the dim light, aiming for the gap beneath the man's arm. The blade sank deep, and the mercenary crumpled with a gurgling cry. Lyra stayed near him, her presence a steady hum in his mind, guiding his movements with uncanny precision. He ducked a swinging blade before it could connect, the Whisperlink warning him a heartbeat ahead. "Left," she called, her voice cutting through the chaos, and he pivoted, driving his dagger into the side of another attacker. Blood sprayed across his coat, warm and sticky, but he barely noticed. Lyra's connection sharpened his senses, made him faster, more lethal than he'd ever been alone. Sira fought like a storm, her wings slashing through the air, pinning a third man against a tree as her claws tore into his shoulder. "Weak," she snarled, tossing him aside like a rag doll. Vera moved with a different grace, her hands weaving patterns in the air as she summoned the jungle itself. Crimson vines erupted from the ground, snaking around a mercenary's legs and dragging him down with a scream. Her silver eyes glowed faintly, her focus absolute, but Elias caught the strain in her posture. The magic took its toll. "They're retreating," she called, her voice taut as the remaining attackers faltered, their line breaking under the onslaught. Elias pressed forward, Lyra's Whisperlink feeding him their panic, their confusion. He could almost taste it, fear bitter and sharp. But then a new shadow loomed, a hulking figure stepping from the trees, his armor heavier, his presence colder than the others. A long sword gleamed in his hand, its edge catching the scarlet light as he advanced. "Enough," he rumbled, his voice gravelly and commanding. "You're mine now." Sira whirled to face him, her wings flaring, but he moved faster, his blade slicing through the air toward her. Elias shouted, lunging to intercept, but Sira twisted at the last second, the sword grazing her side instead of cleaving her in two. She hissed in pain, blood dripping from the shallow cut, staining her borrowed shirt. "Zane," she spat, recognizing him as she stumbled back. Elias reached her side, his dagger raised, but the man, Zane, only laughed a low, guttural sound that chilled the air. "You thought you'd slip away, Sira," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. "The council pays well for your kind, dead or alive." Lyra pressed against Elias, her breath ragged, and he felt her fear spike through the Whisperlink, mingling with his own rage. "We need to run," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's too strong." Vera's vines surged again, buying them a moment as they wrapped around Zane's boots, but he hacked them away with brutal efficiency. "Go!" Elias barked, shoving Sira toward the trees as Lyra clung to his arm. They bolted, the jungle swallowing them as Zane's roar echoed behind. The Whisperlink pulsed between them, a lifeline in the chaos. Sira's strength, Lyra's intuition, Vera's calm resolve weaving into his own determination. They'd survived, but barely, and Elias knew this was only the beginning. Zane wouldn't stop, and the jungle, for all its secrets, couldn't hide them forever. Zane wouldn't stop, and the jungle, for all its secrets, couldn't hide them forever. Elias pushed through the crimson undergrowth, his breath ragged as he led Sira, Lyra, and Vera deeper into the forest's heart. The glow of the vines overhead cast fleeting shadows across their path, the air thick with the scent of sap and the copper tang of Sira's blood. She pressed a hand to her side, her borrowed shirt darkening where Zane's blade had grazed her, but she kept pace, her amber eyes fierce despite the pain. Lyra clung to Elias's arm, her fingers digging into his coat, her presence a steady hum in his mind through the whisper link, fearful yet resolute. Vera trailed behind, her silver hair a beacon in the dimness, her steps silent but purposeful. They stumbled into a shallow ravine, its walls lined with jagged stone and a thin stream gurgling at its base. A cave yawned ahead, its mouth half hidden by a curtain of glowing vines. In there, Elias panted, shoving the tendrils aside to reveal a damp, narrow chamber. Sira ducked inside first, her wings folding tight as she sank against the wall, her breath hissing through clenched teeth. Elias guided Lyra in, her violet eyes wide as she scanned the space, then turned to help Vera, who paused to trace a quick rune at the entrance. The faint glow of her magic flared, sealing them in a fragile cocoon of concealment. "We can't keep running like this," Sira growled, her voice strained as she peeled the shirt away to inspect her wound. The cut was shallow but angry, blood streaking her red skin in dark rivulets. Elias knelt beside her, pulling a strip of cloth from his pack. "Let me," he said, his tone firm despite the tremor in his hands. She glared at him, her tail flicking, but relented, leaning back as he pressed the cloth to her side. Her skin was warm beneath his fingers, taut and smooth, and he felt a flush creep up his neck as their eyes locked. Hers defiant, his unsteady. "You're reckless," he muttered, tying the makeshift bandage. She smirked, a flash of teeth. "And you're soft, human, but it's keeping us alive." Lyra's soft laugh broke the tension, drawing their attention. She sat near the stream, her wings glistening with mist, her gaze distant as she trailed her fingers through the water. "He's more than that," she said, her voice a melody that soothed the raw edges of the moment. Elias rose, wiping his hands on his coat, and crossed to her, the whisper link tugging at him like a thread. "You're still in my head," he said, half accusing, half curious. She looked up, her purple eyes catching the moonlight that slipped through a crack in the cave's ceiling, and smiled. "You're in mine, too." Before he could respond, she stood, her movements fluid despite the exhaustion etched into her face. She stepped closer, the damp air clinging to her ragged clothing, outlining the gentle curves of her body. "We're safe for now," she murmured, her hand finding his chest, resting over his racing heart. The whisper link surged, flooding him with her relief, her fear, and something deeper, a longing that mirrored his own. He didn't pull away this time. His hand rose, cupping her face, his thumb brushing the soft line of her jaw. Her breath hitched, and then she leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both tender and desperate. The world narrowed to the heat of her mouth, the press of her body against his, damp and warm from the jungle's embrace. His fingers threaded through her violet hair, pulling her closer as adrenaline and need crashed through him. She responded with equal fervor, her wings trembling as they brushed his arms, her hands sliding beneath his coat to grip his shoulders. The whisper link flared, amplifying every sensation, her pulse against his, her soft gasps echoing in his mind. It was overwhelming, intoxicating, a union that transcended the physical, binding them in a way he couldn't fathom. A sharp cough snapped them apart. Sira stood, her arms crossed, her smirk returning despite the bandage at her side. "Save it for later," she said, her voice laced with amusement. "Unless you wanted to join in." Elias flushed, stepping back, but Lyra only laughed, her cheeks flushed as she smoothed her hair. "You're jealous," she teased, and Sira's tail flicked, her eyes glinting. "Maybe," she admitted, sauntering to the stream. She shed the bloodied shirt, letting it fall as she knelt to wash, the moonlight playing across her red skin in a way that made Elias's throat tighten. She glanced back, catching his stare, and grinned. "Eyes up here, human." Vera's voice cut through the moment, calm and measured. "They're still out there," she said, her runes dimming as she joined them. "Zane won't rest." Elias nodded, forcing his focus back to the danger. But Lyra's kiss lingered, a fire in his veins, and Sira's bold confidence stoked it further. The whisper link hummed between them, a fragile lifeline in the dark, and he knew they'd need each other, to survive what came next. The cave's damp air settled around them, the faint drip of water from the ceiling marking time as Elias wrestled with the heat Lyra's kiss had ignited. Sira's teasing lingered too, her bare form by the stream of vision he couldn't fully banish, though he kept his eyes fixed on the cave's entrance, dagger in hand. Vera's runes glowed faintly, a fragile barrier against the jungle's threats, while Lyra sat close, her presence a steady pulse through the whisper link, grounding him even as it stirred him. The silence was a fragile thing, stretched thin by the weight of their escape and the unspoken tension weaving between them. A rustle outside snapped him to attention, his grip tightening on the blade. Sira rose from the stream, water cascading down her skin as she snatched the spare shirt, pulling it on with a fluid grace that belied her injury. "They're back," she hissed, her claws flexing. Vera's runes flared, then dimmed, her silver eyes narrowing. "No," she said, her voice low. "It's different, someone new." Elias crept to the entrance, parting the vines just enough to peer out. The crimson jungle was still, the glowing tendrils swaying gently. But then a figure emerged from the shadows. Not Zane, but someone he knew all too well. "Mara," he breathed, the name a curse and a memory rolled into one. She stepped into the moonlight, her leather armor hugging her frame, her dark hair pulled tight in a braid that swung as she moved. A long sword hung at her hip, its hilt worn from use, and her green eyes, sharp, familiar, scanned the ravine with a predator's focus. Sira tensed beside him, her tail stiffening. "Who's she?" she demanded, her voice a growl. Elias swallowed, his past crashing into the present. "Trouble," he said. "Old trouble." Mara's voice rang out, cutting through the night. "Elias, I know you're here," she called, her tone smooth but edged with steel. "Come out. We need to talk." Lyra's hand found his, her whisper link flaring with a sudden spike of jealousy that startled him. "You know her," she said, her voice tight. He nodded, reluctant. "She was someone once, before I came here." Sira snorted, her amber eyes glinting. "Lover," she guessed, and Elias didn't deny it, the weight of that truth pressing against his chest. He stepped out, dagger still in hand, the vines brushing his shoulders as he faced her. Mara's lips curved into a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You look good, Elias," she said, her gaze raking over him with a familiarity that made his skin crawl. "Still running from the council, I see." She moved closer, her hand resting on her sword, and he caught the scent of leather and smoke. Her scent, once comforting, now a warning. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice hard. She tilted her head, her braids slipping over her shoulder. "You, and whatever you're hiding. Zane's not the only one hunting." Sira emerged behind him, her presence a wall of heat and defiance, her claws glinting in the moonlight. "Back off," she snarled, stepping between them. Mara's smile widened, unperturbed. "So this is what you've been keeping," she said, her eyes flicking to Sira's wings, then back to Elias. "Silvara, the council's prize." Lyra followed, her hand brushing Elias's arm, her jealousy a sharp edge in his mind. "She's not your business," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor he felt through the link. Mara laughed, a low, throaty sound, and stepped closer, her fingers trailing along Elias's chest, lingering where Lyra's hand had been. "You always had a weakness for strays," she murmured, her touch a calculated echo of their past. "Come with me, Elias. Hand them over, and I'll make sure the council spares you." Her green eyes locked onto his, promising things he'd once craved, safety, her beside him. But Lyra's presence burned brighter, her whisper link pulling him back, and he shoved Mara's hand away. "Not this time," he said, his voice cold. "I'm done with you." Her smile faded, replaced by a flicker of anger. "You'll regret that," she warned, stepping back as shadows shifted behind her. More mercenaries, her own crew. Lyra tugged him toward the cave, her voice urgent. She's stalling, Zane's close. Sira bared her teeth, her tail lashing. Let her try, she growled, but Elias shook his head, pulling them both inside as Vera's runes flared again. We move at dawn, he said, his mind racing. Mara's arrival wasn't just a threat. It was a fracture, splitting open old wounds and new loyalties. Lyra's jealousy pulsed through the whisper link, Sira's defiance stoked his resolve, and Vera's calm steadied him. Whatever came next, he'd face it with them, not her. Elias pulled the vines shut behind him, sealing the cave's entrance as the echo of Mara's threat lingered in the humid air. The faint glow of Vera's runes pulsed against the stone, a fragile shield against the encroaching night, while the stream's soft gurgle filled the silence. Sira paced near the water, her tail flicking with agitation, the borrowed shirt clinging to her damp skin where she'd washed away the blood. Lyra sat against the wall, her violet eyes fixed on Elias, her presence a steady hum through the whisper link, jealousy fading into something softer, more trusting. Vera knelt by her runes, her silver hair spilling over her shoulders as she reinforced the magic, her calm focus a counterpoint to the storm brewing within him. He sank onto a flat stone, his dagger resting across his knees, Mara's words clawing at the edges of his resolve. She'd been his anchor once, a partner in the chaos of his smuggling days, her laughter a rare light in a world of shadows. But that was before she'd sold him out to the council, before he'd fled to the jungle with nothing but scars and a name they'd branded traitor. Lyra's kiss, Sira's defiance, Vera's quiet strength. They'd stirred something new in him, something Mara could never touch. Yet her presence outside was a reminder. The past didn't let go easily. You're thinking about her, Lyra said, her voice cutting through his reverie like a blade of silk. Elias glanced up, meeting her gaze, and felt the whisper link ripple, a thread of her curiosity weaving into his thoughts. He didn't deny it. She's a ghost, he said, his tone rough. One I thought I'd buried. Sira snorted, pausing her pacing to lean against the wall, her amber eyes glinting. Ghosts don't hunt with swords, she said, her tail brushing the stone with a soft scrape. She's trouble, you're trouble. What's her hold on you? Elias hesitated, the weight of their stares pressing against him. We were together, he admitted, his voice low. Years ago, she betrayed me, turned me over to the council for a bounty. I got out. She didn't. Lyra's hand twitched, as if she wanted to reach for him, but she held back, her wings folding tighter. She still wants you, she said, her whisper link carrying a faint sting of jealousy. He shook his head. She wants what I've got, you. The Silvara. Whatever this whisper link is, it's worth more to them than I ever was. Vera looked up from her runes, her silver eyes sharp and assessing. It's more than you think, she said, her voice cool, but laced with a gravity that made the cave feel smaller. The whisper link isn't just a bond, it's our survival. And it's growing. She rose, brushing dirt from her hands, and stepped closer, the faint glow of her magic illuminating the elegant lines of her face. You've felt it, haven't you? Not just with Lyra, but with all of us. Elias frowned, his mind tracing the edges of the sensation. The way Sira's strength had surged through him during the fight, the way Vera's calm steadied him now. It's bigger, he said, struggling to find the words. Like I'm part of you, all of you. Lyra nodded, her smile faint but warm. It's how we endured, she said. When the council came, they tried to break us, isolated us, caged us. The whisper link kept us whole. It's not just one-to-one. It can bind many if we let it. Sira's tail stilled, her gaze darkening as she crossed her arms. They burned our cities, she said, her voice a low growl that echoed off the stone. Tore us apart piece by piece. They feared what we could do, feared we'd share it with others, unravel their precious order. She stepped closer, her red skin catching the rune light, and Elias felt a surge through the link. Her rage, her pain, a fire that mirrored his own buried wounds. We escaped because of it, she continued. Lyra sensed their plans. I broke the chains, and Vera turned their machines against them. Elias leaned forward, his dagger forgotten as their story unfolded. And now, he asked, what does it mean for me? Vera's lips curved, a rare hint of something softer breaking her stoic mask. You're not Silvara, she said, but you're compatible. The link's adapting, reaching beyond us. That's why you feel us all. Lyra's hand found his at last, her touch warm and electric, and the cave seemed to fade as her presence flooded him. Her hope, her trust, and a flicker of something deeper, a longing that stirred his blood. That night, as the others rested, Elias lay awake, Lyra's head resting against his shoulder, her breath soft against his neck. The whisper link wove through his dreams, visions of Sira's fierce grace, her claws tearing through foes, Vera's quiet power, her runes glowing like stars, and Lyra, her lips on his, her wings wrapping around him in a haze of heat and light. He woke with a start, his body tense, the images lingering like a promise. Sira's voice broke the silence, husky and close. Dreaming of us? She teased from across the cave, her amber eyes glinting in the dark. He flushed, but didn't answer, the whisper link pulsing with their shared secrets, and the danger that waited beyond. And the danger that waited beyond loomed like a shadow over the cave, its presence a constant weight in the humid air. Elias sat up, Lyra's warmth lingering against his side as she stirred, her violet eyes blinking open in the dim glow of Vera's runes. Sira's teasing grin faded, her amber gaze sharpening as she rose from her spot near the stream, her tail flicking with restless energy. Vera stood by the entrance, her silver hair catching the faint light as she traced a new rune, her fingers steady despite the exhaustion etched into her posture. The whisper link hummed between them, a fragile web of shared resolve and unspoken fears, binding them tighter with every passing moment. We can't keep hiding, Elias said, his voice rough but firm as he gripped his dagger. Zane's out there, and now Mara. They'll find us eventually. We need to hit them first. Sira's lips curled into a feral smile, her claws flexing as she stepped closer. Finally, she growled, her red skin shimmering in the rune light. I've been itching to tear something apart. Lyra's hand found his, her touch a quiet anchor, and he felt her through the link, her worry, her trust, a flicker of hope that steadied his racing pulse. Where? She asked, her voice soft but resolute. They'll expect us to run, not fight. Elias nodded, his mind racing as he pieced together a plan. There's an old temple, half a day's trek north, he said. A ruin from before the council's time. Smugglers used it as a stash point. Zane's kind love places like that, fortified, isolated. If he's tracking us, he'll set up there. Vera turned from her runes, her silver eyes narrowing as she considered it. A trap, she said, her tone analytical. We could turn it against them, use the terrain, my magic. But it's risky. Sira snorted, her tail brushing Elias's leg as she leaned in, her breath warm against his ear. Risk's what we're good at, isn't it, human? He met her gaze, the heat of her nearness sparking through him, but he forced his focus back to the plan. We draw them in, he said. Vera sets wards, Sira hits hard, Lyra guides us through the link. I'll take Zane. He's the head of this snake. Lyra's grip tightened, her whisper link flaring with a sudden intensity, her fear for him, her need to keep him close. You don't face him alone, she said, her voice trembling but firm. We do this together. Elias squeezed her hand, the bond between them a lifeline he couldn't deny. Together, he agreed, his resolve hardening. The hours before dawn stretched long, the cave a cocoon of tense preparation. Vera etched runes into the stone, her magic weaving a shroud to mask their departure. Sira sharpened her claws against a rock, her movements fluid and deliberate, her borrowed shirt riding up to reveal the taut lines of her body, a sight Elias tried and failed to ignore. Lyra stayed near him, her presence a constant hum, and as the others worked, She pulled him aside, her wings brushing the air as she led him to the stream's edge. "If this goes wrong," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "I need you to know." He didn't let her finish. His hands found her waist, pulling her close, and he kissed her again, deeper this time, a hunger born of fear and defiance. Her lips parted under his, her body pressing against him, damp and warm from the cave's mist. The whisper link flared, flooding him with her love, her desperation, a fire that matched his own. Her hands slid up his chest, fingers curling into his coat as her wings quivered, brushing his arms in a fleeting, electric caress. "You're not losing me," he murmured against her mouth, his voice rough with promise. "Not now." She pulled back, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, and nodded, her breath ragged. "Then we fight," she said, her resolve mirroring his through the link. Sira's voice cut through the moment, sharp and teasing. "Get a grip, you too," she called, rising with a stretch that highlighted every curve of her form. "We've got blood to spill." Elias flushed, but Lyra smiled, a spark of defiance in her gaze as she took his hand, leading him back to the others. Vera finished her runes, the air thrumming with her magic as she stood. "It's time," she said, her silver eyes meeting his with a quiet intensity that stirred him, different from Lyra's warmth or Sira's fire, but no less potent. Elias nodded, his dagger sheathed at his hip, the whisper link pulsing with their shared strength. They slipped from the cave as dawn broke, the crimson jungle unfurling before them, its secrets a weapon in their hands. Zane waited, Mara lingered, but this time they wouldn't run. They'd strike, and the bond between them would be their edge. The crimson jungle stretched toward the temple like a living maze, its glowing vines curling around ancient stone as Elias and the Silvara approached under the faint light of dawn. The ruin loomed ahead, its crumbling spires clawing at the sky, a fortress of shadow and decay. Elias led the way, his dagger drawn, the whisper link a steady pulse tying him to Sira, Lyra, and Vera. Sira moved beside him, her red skin blending with the foliage, her wings flexing with every step, while Lyra stayed close, her violet eyes scanning the shadows. Vera trailed behind, her silver hair glinting as she whispered to her runes, her magic cloaking their advance in a shimmer of silence. They reached the temple's outer wall, its surface pitted with age and overgrown with crimson tendrils. Voices drifted from within, Zane's gruff bark, the clatter of armor. A dozen mercenaries at least, maybe more. Elias crouched behind a fallen pillar, his breath steady as Lyra's hand brushed his arm. "They're waiting," she murmured, her whisper link flaring with their positions, scattered, armed, tense. Zane's at the center. Sira grinned, her claws glinting as she flexed them. "Good," she said, her voice a low growl. "I owe him a scar." Vera's runes flared briefly, and she nodded. "The wards are set. When they move, we'll know." Elias gave the signal, and they struck. Sira launched herself over the wall, her wings slicing through the air as she landed amid the mercenaries, her claws tearing into the first man before he could scream. Chaos erupted, shouts, the clash of steel, the snap of breaking vines. Elias vaulted after her, his dagger flashing as he took down a second, the whisper link guiding his strikes with Lyra's precision. She stayed near the wall, her voice a lifeline in his mind. "Behind you!" And he spun, parrying a sword that would have split his skull. Vera's magic surged, crimson vines bursting from the ground to ensnare their foes, her silver eyes glowing with focus as she wove the jungle into a weapon. Zane emerged from the temple's heart, his hulking frame dwarfing the others, his longsword gleaming with cruel intent. "You're persistent," he rumbled, his eyes locking on Sira as she dispatched another mercenary. "But it ends here." He charged, his blade a blur, and Sira met him head-on, her wings flaring as she ducked and slashed. Blood sprayed. Hers his, but neither yielded, their fight a brutal dance of steel and claw. Elias moved to join her, but But a new figure cut him off. Mara, her sword raised, her green eyes cold. "You picked the wrong side," she said, striking fast. He parried, the impact jarring his arm, and felt Lyra's panic spike through the link. "Elias," she cried, rushing toward him, but he shouted, "Stay back." Mara pressed her advantage, her blade nicking his shoulder, blood welling hot and fast. The whisper link surged, Sira's strength, Vera's calm, Lyra's desperation, flooding him with a clarity he'd never known. He dodged Mara's next swing, driving his dagger in her thigh. She staggered, cursing, and he kicked her back, turning as Zane's roar echoed through the ruin. Sira was faltering, her side bleeding anew, and Zane's sword arced toward her throat. Elias didn't think. He lunged, shoving her aside as the blade descended, taking the blow across his chest. Pain exploded, white-hot and blinding, blood soaking his coat as he felt his knees. Sira screamed, her claws raking Zane's face, forcing him back, while Lyra reached Elias, her hands pressing against the wound, tears streaming down her face. "No, no, stay with me," she sobbed, her lips brushing his in a frantic, tear-soaked kiss. The whisper link flared, her love pouring into him, a lifeline against the dark. Vera's vines surged, pinning Zane as Sira struck again, her claws sinking deep into his chest. He roared, thrashing, but fell, his blood pooling on the stone. Mara retreated, her crew broken, her eyes meeting Elias's one last time before she vanished into the jungle. Silence fell, heavy and absolute, broken only by Lyra's choked sobs. Elias gripped her hand, his vision blurring, but the whisper link held him. Sira's fire, Vera's strength, Lyra's warmth, refusing to let him fade. "We did it," he rasped, and Lyra nodded, her tears falling onto his chest, a promise they'd survive together anchored Elias as the pain in his chest throbbed, a dull fire beneath Lyra's trembling hands. The temple ruin lay silent around them. Zane's broken body sprawled among the crimson vines, his blood seeping into the ancient stone. Sira stood over him, her claws dripping red, her breath heaving as she wiped them on her torn shirt, her amber eyes blazing with triumph and exhaustion. Vera approached, her silver hair streaked with dirt, her runes fading as she knelt beside Elias, her cool fingers brushing his brow. The whisper link pulsed between them, Sira's fierce pride, Vera's quiet relief, Lyra's desperate love, holding him to the world when darkness clawed at his edges. "You're a fool," Sira said, her voice rough but tinged with something softer as she crouched beside Lyra. "Taking that hit for me." Elias managed a weak grin, blood staining his teeth. "Couldn't let you have all the fun," he rasped, and she snorted, her tail flicking his leg in a rare gesture of affection. Lyra's tears fell onto his chest, mixing with the blood, and she pressed her forehead to his, her whisper link flooding him with her resolve. "You're not leaving us," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Not after this." Vera's hand moved to his wound, her magic flaring, a faint, soothing glow that eased the pain, knitting flesh with a tenderness that belied her stoic facade. "He'll live," she said, her silver eyes meeting Lyra's with a flicker of warmth. "But he needs rest." Elias exhaled, the tension draining from his body as the whisper link steadied him. Their strength a lifeline he clung to. Then Lyra stiffened, her hand tightening on his, and a new sensation rippled through the bond. Shock, wonder, a secret unfolding. "I feel it," she breathed, her purple eyes widening as she pressed a hand to her abdomen. "Something alive." Sira's head snapped up, her tail stilling, and Vera's runes dimmed as she turned, her gaze sharp. "The link?" Vera asked, but Lyra shook her head, a tremulous smile breaking through her tears. "No, a child. Ours." Elias stared at her, the words sinking in through the haze of pain, and the whisper link confirmed it. A faint, new presence, fragile but undeniable, woven into their bond. "Ow!" he croaked, and Lyra laughed, soft and incredulous. The whisper link, It's more than we knew. Sira's grin returned, fierce and proud. A fighter already, she said, her voice husky. Vera nodded, a rare smile softening her features. A bridge, she murmured. Between us all. Elias gripped Lyra's hand. The revelation a light in the darkness. A victory greater than the battle they'd won. They'd beaten Zane, defied the council, and now, together, they'd created something new. The jungle hummed around them, a witness to their survival and their future. The crimson jungle stretched out beneath a sky streaked with dawn, its glowing vines curling around the temple ruin as Elias stood with Lyra at his side, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Weeks had passed since the battle, his chest wound now a jagged scar beneath his coat, a testament to their victory over Zane and the council's hunters. Sira prowled the perimeter, her red skin catching the morning light, her wings flexing as she scanned the horizon, ever the guardian. Vera knelt nearby, her silver hair glinting as she etched runes into a slab of stone, her magic weaving a permanent shroud around the clearing they'd claimed as their own. The whisper link thrummed between them, a living bond that had grown stronger with every shared breath, every quiet moment since Lyra's revelation. The child, a daughter, Lyra insisted, her intuition sharpened by the link, grew within her, a spark of life that bound them closer than ever. Elias felt it sometimes, a faint echo through the whisper link, a presence that carried Lyra's warmth and his own stubborn resolve. They named the clearing Harmony Hollow, a refuge carved from the jungle's heart, its name a promise of what they could build. Others had come, outcasts, fugitives, those who'd fled the council's iron grip, drawn by whispers of the Silvara and the human who'd defied the odds. The temple's ruins became a foundation, its stones repurposed into shelters, its vines trained to shield them from prying eyes. Elias watched as a group of newcomers, humans, a horned creature with golden scales, a pair of winged beings not unlike the Silvara, worked together, their voices mingling with the jungle's hum. Sira approached, her tail brushing his leg as she stopped beside him, her borrowed shirt replaced by a tunic of woven vines that hugged her form. "They keep coming," she said, her voice low, her amber eyes glinting with a mix of pride and wariness. "You've started something human." He nodded, the weight of it settling on his shoulders. "We have," he corrected, glancing at Lyra, who smiled, her hand resting on her slightly rounded belly. Vera rose from her runes, dusting her hands as she joined them, her silver eyes surveying the growing community. "The shroud's complete," she said, her tone calm, but carrying a quiet satisfaction. "They're safe here for now." Elias met her gaze, feeling her strength through the link, a steady anchor that complemented Sira's fire and Lyra's light. "For now," he echoed, knowing the council wouldn't forget them. But Harmony Hollow was more than a hideout. It was a defiance, a proof that the Whisper Link could unite beyond blood, beyond species. Lyra squeezed his hand, drawing him to a vantage point beneath a towering tree, its crimson canopy framing the sky. "Look," she murmured, her voice soft with wonder as she gestured to the figures below. Children laughing, a golden-scaled figure sharing food. Sira teaching a young human how to sharpen a stick. Elias felt her through the link, her hope, her love, a vision of a future where their daughter could grow free. He pulled her close, his arms slipping around her waist, and kissed her temple, the whisper link amplifying the warmth of her nearness. Sira sauntered over, shedding her tunic's outer layer to reveal the shimmering red of her skin, her wings catching the sunlight as she stretched with a grin. "Not bad, human," she said, her tail brushing his leg again, her eyes glinting with a teasing promise. "You got us all tangled up in this." Elias flushed, but Lyra laughed, leaning into him as she swatted Sira playfully. "He's ours," she said, her tone light but possessive, and Sira's grin widened, unrepentant. Vera stepped closer, her presence a quiet counterpoint, her runes glowing faintly at her feet. "It's a start," she said, her silver eyes meeting Elias's with a rare softness. A community, something worth fighting for. Elias nodded, the whisper link weaving their voices into his heart. Sira's fire, Vera's calm, Lyra's love, and the faint echo of their unborn child. Harmony Hollow stood as a beacon, its crimson embrace a promise of peace, and as the sun rose higher, Elias knew they'd build it together, step by step, against whatever shadows came next. The crimson jungle glowed under a twilight sky, its vines shimmering like veins of light as Harmony Hollow buzzed with quiet life below. He stood atop a rise, Lyra nestled against his side, her head resting on his shoulder, her hand tracing the swell of her belly where their daughter grew, a spark of the whisper link that bound them all. Sira prowled the edge of the clearing, her red skin catching the fading sun as she adjusted a makeshift spear, her amber eyes glinting with a restless energy. Vera sat cross-legged nearby, her silver hair spilling over her shoulders as she etched a final rune into a stone tablet, her magic humming softly in the air. "We've done more than survive," Lyra murmured, her voice a melody that wove through the jungle's hum. "We've made something real." Elias felt her through the link, her pride, her love, a vision of their child running beneath these trees, and he tightened his arm around her, his lips brushing her hair. "We have," he said, his voice low but firm. "But it's not enough to stay here. The council's still out there. Mara, others like her. They'll come again." Lyra's hand stilled, her purple eyes lifting to his, and he saw her resolve mirror his own. Sira approached, her tail flicking as she planted the spear into the ground with a thud. "Then we take it to them," she said, her grin fierce and unyielding. "Spread this. Show them what the Whisper Link can do. No more hiding." Elias met her gaze, the fire in her stirring his own, and he nodded. "Not just us," he said. "Everyone here, they're part of it now." Vera rose, dusting her hands as she joined them, her silver eyes calm but bright with purpose. "The link can grow," she said. "Beyond us, beyond this place. It's a seed, plant it, and it'll spread." Lyra smiled, stepping forward to take Sira's hand, then Vera's, pulling them into a circle with Elias at its heart. The whisper link flared, a radiant thread weaving their strengths, Sira's courage, Vera's wisdom, Lyra's hope, and his own stubborn will, into a tapestry stronger than stone. "A journey," Lyra said, her voice trembling with excitement. "To find others, to build more, together." Elias felt the echo of their daughter, a faint pulse of life within the bond, and knew this was her legacy too, a world where no one had to run. Sira shed her tunic's outer layer, her wings stretching wide as she turned to the horizon, her red skin shimmering under the stars. "Let's move," she said, her voice husky with promise. Vera packed her runes, her silver gaze lingering on Elias with a quiet trust that warmed him. Lyra pressed against him, her lips finding his in a brief, fierce kiss, the whisper link amplifying her love until it filled him completely. "With you," she whispered, and he nodded, his hand resting over hers, over their future. They stepped forward as one, the crimson jungle parting before them, its glow a beacon under a sky thick with stars. Harmony Hollow stood behind, a foundation of defiance and peace, but their paths stretched beyond, into the unknown, into a world they'd reshape together. Whatever shadows waited, they'd face them, not as fugitives, but as a family, their bond a light no darkness could extinguish.